Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization by Bryan Ward-Perkins. Narrated by Roger Clark. 1. Did Rome ever fall? On an October evening in 1764, after some intoxicating days visiting the remains of ancient Rome, Edward Gibbon sat musing amidst the ruins of the capital, and resolved to write a history of the city's decline and fall. The grandeur of ancient Rome and the melancholy of its ruins had awoken his curiosity and imagination, and had planted the seed for his great historical endeavor. Gibbon's fascination with the dissolution of a world that seemed quite literally set in stone is not surprising. Deep within the European psyche lies an anxiety that, if ancient Rome could fall, so too can the proudest of modern civilizations. In Gibbon's day, and until very recently, few people questioned age-old certainties about the passing of the ancient world, namely, that a high point of human achievement, the civilization of Greece and Rome, was destroyed in the West by hostile invasions during the 5th century. Invaders, whom the Romans called quite simply the barbarians, and whom modern scholars have termed more sympathetically the Germanic peoples, crossed into the empire over the Rhine and Danube frontiers, beginning a process that was to lead to the dissolution not only of the Roman political structure, but also of the Roman way of life. The first people to enter the empire in force were Goths, who in 376 crossed the Danube, fleeing from the nomadic Huns who had recently appeared on the Eurasian steppes. Initially, the Goths threatened only the eastern half of the Roman Empire, rule at the time being divided between two co-emperors, one resident in the western provinces, the other in the east. 2 years later, in 378, they inflicted a bloody defeat on the empire's eastern army, at the Battle of Hadrianopolis, modern Edirne in Turkey, near the border with Bulgaria. In 401, however, it was the turn of the West to suffer invasion, when a large army of Goths left the Balkans and entered northern Italy. This began a period of great difficulty for the Western Empire, seriously exacerbated at the very end of 406, when 3 tribes, the Vandals, Sueves, and Alans, crossed the Rhine into Gaul. Thereafter, there were always Germanic armies within the borders of the Western Empire, gradually acquiring more and more power and territory. The Vandals, for instance, were able to cross the Straits of Gibraltar in 429, and by 439 had captured the capital of Roman Africa. In 476, 75 years after the Goths had first entered Italy, the last Roman emperor resident in the West, the young and aptly named Romulus Augustulus, Romulus the Little Emperor, was deposed and sent into retirement. The West was now ruled by independent Germanic kings. By contrast, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we often called the Byzantine Empire, did not fall, despite pressure from the Goths and later from the Huns. Indeed, in the 530s, the Eastern Emperor, Justinian, was strong enough to intervene in the Germanic West, capturing the Vandals' African kingdom in 533 and starting a war of conquest of the Ostrogoths' Italian kingdom 2 years later, in 535. Only in 1453 did the Byzantine Empire finally disappear, when its capital and last bastion, Constantinople, fell to the Turkish army of Mehmed the Conqueror. According to the conventional view of things, the military and political disintegration of Roman power in the West precipitated the end of a civilization. Ancient sophistication died, leaving the Western world in the grip of a dark age of material and intellectual poverty, out of which it was only slowly to emerge. Gibbon's contemporary, the Scottish historian William Robertson, expressed this view in a particularly forceful manner in 1770, but his words evoke an image of the Dark Ages that has had very wide currency. In less than a century after the barbarian nations settled in their new conquests, almost all the effects of the knowledge and civility which the Romans had spread through Europe disappeared. Not only the arts of elegance, which minister to luxury and are supported by it, but many of the useful arts, without which life can scarcely be contemplated as comfortable, were neglected or lost. In other words, with the fall of the empire, art, philosophy, and decent drains all vanished from the West. I was born and brought up in Rome, the heart of the empire, surrounded by the same ruins of past greatness that had moved Gibbon. And my father was a classical archaeologist, whose main interest was the remarkable technical and architectural achievements of the Romans. The essential outlines of Robertson's view have therefore always come naturally to me. From early youth, I have known that the ancient Romans built things on a scale and with a technical expertise that could only be dreamed of for centuries after the fall of the empire. Ancient Rome had 11 aqueducts, bringing water to the city through channels up to 59 miles long, which is roughly the distance from Oxford to London, sometimes on arches 100 feet high, and 16 of the massive columns that form the portico of the Pantheon are monoliths, each 46 feet high, laboriously extracted from a quarry high up in the eastern desert of Egypt, manhandled down to the Nile and brought hundreds of miles by water to the empire's capital. It is very difficult not to be impressed by achievements like these, particularly when one finds them replicated on a smaller and more human scale throughout the provinces of the empire. Pompeii, with its paved streets, raised pavements, public baths, and regularly spaced water fountains, and the hundreds of other cities of the Roman world that were like it, in their own quiet way make an even deeper impression than the overblown grandeur that was Rome. Despite my upbringing, I have never much liked the ancient Romans. To me, they too often seemed self-important and self-satisfied, and I have much more sympathy for the chaotic and difficult world of post-Roman times. On the other hand, it has always seemed self-evident that the Romans were able to do remarkable things, which after the fall of the empire could not be done again for many hundreds of years. Banishing catastrophe. It has therefore come as a surprise to me to find a much more comfortable vision of the end of empire spreading in recent years through the English-speaking world. The intellectual guru of this movement is a brilliant historian and stylist, Peter Brown, who published in 1971 The World of Late Antiquity. In it, he defined a new period, Late Antiquity, beginning in around AD 200 and lasting right up to the 8th century, characterized not by the dissolution of half the Roman Empire, but by vibrant religious and cultural debate. As Brown himself subsequently wrote, he was able in his book to narrate the history of these centuries without invoking an intervening catastrophe and without pausing for a moment to pay lip service to the widespread notion of decay. Decay was banished and replaced by a religious and cultural revolution, beginning under the late empire and continuing long after it. This view has had a remarkable effect, particularly in the United States, where Brown now lives and works. A recent guide to late antiquity, published by Harvard University Press, asks us to treat the period between around 250 and 800 as a distinctive and quite decisive period of history that stands on its own, rather than as the story of the unraveling of a once glorious and higher state of civilization. This is a bold challenge to the conventional view of darkening skies and gathering gloom as the empire dissolved. The impact of this new thinking has admittedly been mixed. In particular, amongst the wider reading public, a bleak post-Roman Dark Age seems to be very much alive and well. Bernard Cornwell's historical novels about this period are international bestsellers. The blurb on the back of The Winter King sets the grim but heroic scene. In the Dark Ages, a legendary warrior struggles to unite Britain. Arthur, for it is he, is a battle-hardened warlord, living in a wooden hall, in a Britain that is manly, sombre, and definitely decaying. At one point, the remains of a half-ruined Roman mosaic pavement are further shattered, when Dark Age warriors bang their spear ends on the floor to approve the decisions of their leaders. However, amongst historians, the impact of the new late antiquity has been marked, particularly on the way that the end of the Roman world is now packaged. There has been a sea change in the language used to describe post-Roman times. Words like decline and crisis, which suggest problems at the end of the empire and which were quite usual into the 1970s, have largely disappeared from historians' vocabularies to be replaced by neutral terms like transition, change, and transformation. For instance, a massive European-funded project of research into the period 300 to 800 chose as its title The Transformation of the Roman World. There is no hint here of decline, fall, or crisis, nor even of any kind of end to the Roman world. Transformation suggests that Rome lived on, though gradually metamorphosed into a different but not necessarily inferior form. The image is of a lively organism, evolving to meet new circumstances. It is a long way from the traditional view in which catastrophe destroys the magnificent Roman dinosaur, but leaves a few tiny Dark Age mammals alive, to evolve very slowly over the coming centuries into the sophisticated creatures of the Renaissance. Accommodating the barbarians. Along a parallel route, leading in essentially the same direction, some historians in recent decades have also questioned the entire premise that the dissolution of the Roman Empire in the West was caused by hostile and violent invasion. Just as transformation has become the buzzword for cultural change in this period, so accommodation is now the fashionable word to explain how peoples from outside the empire came to live within it and rule it. Here, too, old certainties are being challenged. According to the traditional account, the West was, quite simply, overrun by hostile waves of Germanic peoples. The long-term effects of these invasions have, admittedly, been presented in very different ways, depending largely on the individual historian's nationality and perspective. For some, particularly in the Latin countries of Europe, the invasions were entirely destructive. For others, however, they brought an infusion of new and freedom-loving Germanic blood into a decadent empire. Witness, for instance, the words of the 18th-century German philosopher Herder. Expiring Rome lay for centuries on her deathbed, a deathbed extending over the whole world, which could render her no assistance but that of accelerating her death. Barbarians came to perform this office, northern giants to whom the enervated Romans appeared dwarfs. They ravaged Rome and infused new life into expiring Italy. But while there has always been a lively debate about the long-term consequences of the invasions, until recently very few have seriously questioned the violence and disruption of the Germanic takeover of power. Indeed, for some, a good bloodletting was a decidedly purgative experience. In a book written for children, the 19th-century English historian Edward Freeman robustly defended the brutality with which his own Anglo-Saxon ancestors had eliminated their rivals, the Romano-Britons, the ancestors of the Welsh. It has turned out much better in the end that our forefathers did thus kill or drive out nearly all the people whom they found in the land, since otherwise I cannot think that we should ever have been so great and free a people as we have been for many ages. While the children of Victorian England may have enjoyed Freeman's prose, one wonders what was made of these sentiments in Wales. Unsurprisingly, an image of violent and destructive Germanic invasion was very much alive in continental Europe in the years that immediately followed the Second World War. But in the latter half of the 20th century, as a new and peaceful Western Europe became established, views of the invaders gradually softened and became more positive. For instance, book titles like The Germanic Invasions, The Making of Europe, A.D. 400 to 600 of 1975, did not question the reality of the invasions, but did present them as a positive force in the shaping of modern Europe. More recently, however, some historians have gone very much further than this, notably the Canadian historian Walter Goffart, who, in 1980, launched a challenge to the very idea of 5th-century invasions. He argued that the Germanic peoples were the beneficiaries of a change in Roman military policy. Instead of continuing the endless struggle to keep them out, the Romans decided to accommodate them into the empire by an ingenious and effective arrangement. The newcomers were granted a proportion of the tax revenues of the Roman state, and the right to settle within the imperial frontiers. In exchange, they ceased their attacks, and diverted their energies into upholding Roman power, of which they were now stakeholders. In effect, they became the Roman defense force. The empire had better things to do than engage in a ceaseless, sterile effort to exclude foreigners for whom it could find useful employment. Goffart was very well aware that sometimes Romans and Germanic newcomers were straightforwardly at war, but he argued that the 5th century was less momentous for invasions than for the incorporation of barbarian protectors into the fabric of the West. In a memorable sound-bite, he summed up his argument. What we call the fall of the Western Roman Empire was an imaginative experiment that got a little out of hand. Rome did fall, but only because it had voluntarily delegated away its own power, not because it had been successfully invaded. Like the new and positive late antiquity, the idea that the Germanic invasions were in fact a peaceful accommodation has had a mixed reception. The world at large has seemingly remained content with a dramatic fall of the Roman Empire, played out as a violent and brutal struggle between invaders and invaded. But, amongst historians, the new thinking has definitely had an effect, particularly on the overall packaging of the Germanic settlements. For instance, a recent European volume about the first post-Roman states is entitled Kingdoms of the Empire, the Integration of Barbarians in Late Antiquity. There is no hint here of invasion or force, nor even that the Roman Empire came to an end. Instead, there is a strong suggestion that the incomers fitted easily into a continuing and evolving Roman world. To be fair, Goffart himself acknowledged that his account of peaceful accommodation was not the full story. Some of the Germanic incomers had simply seized what they wanted by violence. After all, he stated clearly that the late Roman experiment in buying military support had got a little out of hand. But such nuances seem to have been forgotten in some recent works, which present the theory of peaceful accommodation as a universally applicable model to explain the end of the Roman Empire. For instance, two distinguished American historians have recently stated that the barbarian settlements occurred in a natural, organic, and generally irenic manner, and take issue with those historians who still demonize the barbarians and problematize the barbarian settlements. In other words, those who still believe in violent and unpleasant invasion. As someone who is convinced that the coming of the Germanic peoples was very unpleasant for the Roman population, and that the long-term effects of the dissolution of the empire were dramatic, I feel obliged to challenge such views. Part 1. The Fall of Rome. 2. The Horrors of War. In 446, Leo, Bishop of Rome, wrote to his colleagues in the North African province of Mauritania Caesariensis. In this letter, Leo grappled with the problem of how the Church should treat nuns raped by the Vandals some 15 years earlier, as they passed through Mauritania on their way to Carthage. Handmaids of God who have lost the integrity of their honor through the oppression of the barbarians, as he discreetly put it. His suggestion was intended to be humane, though it will seem cruel to a modern reader. He agreed that these women had not sinned in mind. Nonetheless, he decreed that the violation of their bodies placed them in a new intermediate status, above holy widows who had chosen celibacy only late in life, but below holy virgins who were bodily intact. Leo advised the raped women that they will be more praiseworthy in their humility and sense of shame if they do not dare to compare themselves to uncontaminated virgins. These unfortunate nuns and Bishop Leo would be very surprised and not a little shocked to learn that it is now fashionable to play down the violence and unpleasantness of the invasions that brought down the empire in the West. The use and the threat of force. The Germanic invaders of the Western Empire seized or extorted through the threat of force the vast majority of the territories in which they settled, without any formal agreement on how to share resources with their new Roman subjects. The impression given by some recent historians that most Roman territory was formally ceded to them as part of treaty arrangements is quite simply wrong. Wherever the evidence is moderately full, as it is from the Mediterranean provinces, conquest or surrender to the threat of force was definitely the norm, not peaceful settlement. A treaty between the Roman government and the Visigoths, which settled the latter in Aquitaine in 419, features prominently in all recent discussions of accommodation. But those historians who present this settlement as advantageous to Romans and Visigoths alike do not go on to say that the territory granted in 419 was tiny in comparison to what the Visigoths subsequently wrested by actual force, or by the threat of force, from the Roman government and from the Roman provincials. The agreed settlement of 419 was centered on the Garonne Valley, between Toulouse and Bordeaux. By the end of the century, the Visigoths had expanded their power in all directions, conquering or extorting a vastly larger area. All southwest Gaul as far as the Pyrenees, Provence, including the two great cities of Arles and Marseille, Clermont and the Auvergne, and almost the entire Iberian Peninsula. From Clermont we have some contemporary evidence of the local response to their expansion. Armed resistance was organized by the city's bishop and aristocracy, and was for a time vigorous and effective. Clermont surrendered to the Visigoths only on the orders of the Roman government in Italy, which hoped thereby to save Provence and the strategically much more important cities of Arles and Marseille. We are told, admittedly by a very partisan source, that at one point during a siege, rather than surrender, the starving inhabitants of Clermont were reduced to eating grass. This is all a very far cry from a peaceful and straightforward accommodation of the Visigoths into the provincial life of Roman Gaul. The experience of conquest was, of course, very varied across the empire. Some regions were overrun brutally but swiftly. For example, the Vandals' conquest of North Africa, starting in 429 and culminating in the capture of Carthage in 439, was a terrible shock to an area of the empire that had escaped unscathed earlier troubles, and we have already encountered the nuns of Mauritania who were caught up in this violence. But after 439, Africa was spared further Germanic invasion, although it increasingly had its own native problems from the fierce Berber tribes of the interior. Other regions, particularly those near the frontiers of the empire, suffered from much more prolonged violence. Northern, eastern, and central Gaul, for instance, were contested in the 5th century between a bewildering number of warring groups. Romans, Bacchidae, Britons, Saxons, Franks, Burgundians, Thuringians, Alamans, Alans, and Goths all fought for control of Gaul, sometimes in alliance with each other, but sometimes fragmented into even smaller groupings. This unrest lasted for almost a century after the Germanic crossing of the Rhine during the winter of 406 to 407. In this part of the Roman world, a degree of internal peace and stability returned only at the end of the 5th century, with the establishment of larger Frankish and Burgundian kingdoms. Similarly, though for a somewhat shorter period, from 409 until the Visigothic conquests of the 470s, control of the Iberian Peninsula was fought over by Romans, Bacchidae, Alans, Sueves, Goths, and 2 distinct groups of Vandals. The Chronicle, written by Hydatius, a bishop based in the northwest of the peninsula, gives a highly abbreviated but nonetheless depressing account of the repeated raiding and invasion that were the inevitable consequences of this contest for power. Hydatius associated the arrival of the barbarians in Spain with the 4 scourges prophesied in the Book of Revelations, and claimed that mothers were even driven to kill, cook, and eat their own children. More prosaically and more reliably, in 460, he himself was seized inside his cathedral church by a band of Sueves who held him prisoner for 3 months. Even those few regions that eventually passed relatively peacefully into Germanic control had all previously experienced invasion and devastation. For instance, the territory in Aquitaine that was ceded to the Visigoths in the settlement of 419 had already suffered raids and devastation between 407 and 409, and in 413 large parts of it had again been ravaged, this time by the Visigoths themselves, the future peaceful settlers of the region. A similar story can be told of Italy and of the city of Rome. During the middle years of the 5th century, Italy slipped slowly and quietly into Germanic hands, culminating in a coup and brief civil war in 476, which deposed the last resident Western emperor, sent him into retirement, and established an independent kingdom. If this were the whole story of Italy's late antique contact with the Germanic peoples, it would indeed have been a remarkably peaceful transition. However, between 401 and 412 the Goths had marched, at one time or another, the length and breadth of the peninsula, while in 405 to 406 another invading army had troubled the north and center. The widespread damage caused by these incursions is shown by the extensive tax relief that the imperial government was forced to grant in 413, the year after the Goths had left the peninsula. This was a time when the emperor desperately needed more rather than less money, not only to fight the invaders but also to resist a string of pretenders to the throne. Yet it was decreed in 413 that, for a 5-year period, all the provinces of central and southern Italy were to be excused 4/5 of their tax burden in order to restore them to well-being. Furthermore, the damage that the Goths had inflicted appears to have been long-lasting. In 418, 6 years after the Goths had left Italy for good, several provinces were still struggling to pay even this substantially reduced rate of taxation, and had to be granted an extended and increased remission. The city of Rome was a powerful bargaining counter in negotiations with the Western Emperor, and it was repeatedly besieged by the Goths before being captured and sacked over.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?